Daniel Hayes thought the worst of the war was behind him. For 2 years, he and his service dog, Ranger, had found peace in a cabin on the coast of Maine, miles from anyone. But on a gray October morning, when smoke rose from an uninhabited island 3 miles offshore, everything changed. What Daniel didn't know was that responding to that distant signal would lead him into a rescue that no one thought possible. And what he found on that island didn't just save lives, it gave him back the part of himself he thought was gone forever. The wind cut across Penobscot Bay that morning, carrying the smell of salt and approaching rain. Daniel Hayes stood on the weathered dock behind his cabin, coffee mug warming his hands, watching the horizon through the October mist. Ranger sat beside him, the German shepherd's ears forward and alert. They'd been out here for 2 years now. 2 years since Daniel left the VA hospital with discharge papers and a service dog trained to wake him from nightmares. 2 years since he'd stopped trying to explain to people what it felt like to be back in a world that seemed too bright, too loud, too careless with its safety. The cabin had been his grandfather's, isolated, quiet. Just Daniel, Ranger, and the ocean that asked nothing of him except respect. He'd built a routine here: wake at dawn, coffee on the dock, maintenance around the property, long walks through the pine forest, simple work that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering back to places it shouldn't go. Ranger's low growl pulled Daniel from his thoughts. The dog was staring east toward Seal Island. Daniel had never set foot on the rocky outcrop 3 miles offshore. According to the locals, nobody had lived there for 50 years. The old lighthouse had been automated decades ago, and the keeper's house had long since collapsed into the Atlantic wind. But something was wrong. A thin column of smoke rose from the island's interior, dark gray against the lighter sky. Not the dissipating smoke of a campfire or the scattered haze of fog. This was sustained, deliberate, or desperate. Daniel set down his coffee. His mind shifted into a different gear, one he hadn't used since Afghanistan. Smoke meant fire. Fire on an uninhabited island meant either someone shouldn't be there or someone needed help. He pulled his phone from his pocket. No signal. The cabin was in a dead zone, which was half the reason he'd chosen it. The nearest working phone was in town, 12 miles away. The smoke continued to rise. Could be nothing, Daniel said aloud, though Ranger's attention never wavered from the island. Could be some kids messing around. But kids wouldn't be on Seal Island. The currents around it were notorious, and local boats gave it wide berth except in summer when the water calmed. October seas were already turning rough. No one in their right mind would take a pleasure boat out there now. Daniel went inside and pulled the marine radio from the shelf. He'd bought it months ago, more out of safety protocol than any expectation of needing it. He cycled through the Coast Guard frequency. Static. He tried again. Nothing but the hiss of empty channels. The radio had been working last week when he'd tested it. He checked the battery. Full charge. He repositioned the antenna. Still nothing but white noise. Through the window he could see the smoke still climbing into the sky. Steadier now. Not spreading like a forest fire, but concentrated. Like someone was feeding it. Like someone was sending a signal. Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew distress signals. He'd sent them. He'd responded to them. And everything in his training, every instinct developed over 2 combat deployments, told him that smoke meant someone needed help. He went to the shed and pulled the tarp off his grandfather's 16-foot aluminum fishing boat. The Johnson outboard was old but reliable. He'd kept it maintained without really knowing why. The boat had been sitting unused since he'd arrived. Daniel had no interest in fishing, and he sure as hell had no interest in socializing with other boaters. But he'd kept it running. Some part of him, the part that had been a combat medic, had known that readiness mattered. Ranger watched as Daniel muscled the boat down to the water on its trailer. The dog didn't bark, didn't whine. He just waited, understanding in the way only service dogs do that something had changed. "You're coming," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. Ranger had been with him through 2 years of darkness. Whatever was on that island, they'd face it together. Daniel loaded supplies into the boat. First aid kit, emergency blanket, flares, rope, water, the .45 caliber pistol he'd bought for property protection and hoped never to use. He strapped on a life jacket and fitted Ranger with the specialized canine flotation vest he'd bought but never needed. The waves were building. 2-foot swells that would get worse as he moved away from the protected bay. The sky was darkening to the east. Rain coming, maybe worse. Every rational part of his brain told him to drive to town, report the smoke, let the Coast Guard handle it. But the Coast Guard was 40 minutes away on a good day. Whatever was happening on Seal Island was happening now. Daniel started the outboard. The engine caught on the second pull, its familiar rumble cutting through the wind. Ranger jumped into the bow without hesitation, planting his paws wide for balance. They pushed away from the dock. The water was rougher than it looked from shore. The boat rose and fell with each swell, spray catching Daniel in the face. He kept the throttle steady, pointing the bow toward that distant column of smoke. Ranger stayed planted at the front, his gaze fixed forward. 20 minutes out, Daniel could make out the rocky shoreline of Seal Island. The smoke was coming from somewhere inland, behind the collapsed lighthouse. The island was maybe 40 acres of pine trees, granite outcroppings, and treacherous tide pools. No beach, no easy landing. 30 minutes out, the smoke was darker, thicker. And then it stopped. One moment, the signal was there. The next, nothing but gray sky and darker clouds rolling in from the Atlantic. Daniel's stomach dropped. Either someone had put the fire out because they'd seen him coming, or they'd run out of things to burn, or... He didn't finish the thought. He pushed the throttle forward, ignoring the way the boat slammed against the waves. Ranger shifted his stance but didn't leave his post. As they approached the island's lee side, Daniel spotted something that made his blood run cold. A capsized boat. White fiberglass hull turned turtle against the rocks, waves pounding it with each surge. The kind of boat someone would take out for a day cruise. The kind of boat that had no business being out here in October. And on the rocky shore, barely visible through the spray and mist, a splash of orange. A life jacket. Daniel killed the engine 50 yards from shore, letting the boat drift as he assessed the situation. The capsized vessel was a 20-foot cabin cruiser, probably worth 40 grand when it was right side up. Now it was just another piece of wreckage being claimed by the Atlantic. The orange life jacket lay motionless on the rocks. Ranger whined softly, his body tense. "I know, boy." Daniel's voice was steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. This was the moment where you either moved forward or turned back, where training either took over or fell away. He'd done this before. He'd gone toward danger while others ran from it. The difference was, back then, he'd had a platoon. He'd had backup. He'd had a mission. Now he had a service dog and a fishing boat. The shore was all granite ledges and tide pools, no dock, no beach, just rocks that would smash the aluminum hull if he got too close. Daniel spotted a slightly calmer section where the rocks formed a natural cove. He started the engine and maneuvered carefully, using every bit of his grandfather's teaching about reading water. 10 feet from the rocks, he shut down the engine and grabbed the bowline. "Ranger, stay." The dog didn't argue, though every muscle in his body said he wanted to follow. Daniel jumped. His boots hit slick granite, and his right foot immediately slid. He caught himself on a handhold, scraped his palm, and scrambled up to a more stable position. The boat drifted slightly, but the bow line held. He secured it to a boulder, tested it twice, then looked back at Ranger. "Come." The German Shepherd launched himself from the boat, landed with better grace than Daniel had managed, and immediately moved to his side. Together they picked their way across the rocks toward the orange life jacket. It was empty. Daniel's hands were shaking as he picked it up. The jacket was soaked, straps still fastened. Someone had been wearing it. Someone had gotten out of it, which meant either they'd made it to shore or... He didn't let himself finish that thought. "Find!" he commanded Ranger, though the dog was already moving, nose to the ground, working in a grid pattern the way he'd been trained for search and rescue support. The smoke had come from inland. The boat had wrecked on the shore. Someone had either climbed up from here or been washed up. If they were alive, they'd have gone for higher ground, for shelter. Ranger's bark cut through the wind, not his alert bark, his "I found something" bark. Daniel scrambled over the rocks, following the sound. The dog was 50 yards away at the edge of the tree line, standing over another life jacket. This one was child-sized. The world tilted slightly. A child. Someone had brought a child out here in October, in rough seas, in a boat that wasn't meant for this kind of water. Daniel grabbed the small orange jacket. It was dry underneath, which meant whoever had been wearing it had made it onto land. A child who'd survived the wreck, who'd climbed these rocks, who'd gone into those trees. A child who'd been signaling with smoke. "Good boy, Ranger. Find!" The dog moved into the forest, and Daniel followed. The pine trees blocked most of the wind, but the temperature was dropping. Rain was coming. He could feel it. If there was a kid out here, wet and scared and alone. The trail was obvious once he knew what to look for. Broken branches, disturbed pine needles, small footprints in the soft earth, signs of someone moving fast, maybe panicked, deeper into the island. 100 yards in, they found the fire. Someone had built it in a small clearing, using deadwood and pine needles. Stones ringed it to contain the flames, and there were clear signs that whoever built it knew what they were doing. They'd used green pine boughs to make it smoke. Smart, very smart. But the fire was out now, deliberately smothered with dirt. Daniel crouched beside it, still warm. Minutes old, maybe, which meant a crack of branches behind him. Daniel spun, hand going instinctively to the pistol at his belt. Ranger's hackles went up, but his tail was level, not aggressive, cautious. From behind a massive pine tree, a figure emerged. Not a child, a girl, teenager maybe, 15 or 16. Soaking wet, her dark hair plastered to her face, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt that hung heavy with water. She held a thick branch in both hands like a baseball bat, her arms shaking but her stance firm. "Stay back," she said. Her voice cracked, but the words were clear. "I mean it." Daniel raised both hands slowly, deliberately. "I'm not here to hurt you. I saw your signal. The smoke. I came to help." The girl didn't lower the branch. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated. Shock. Hypothermia, maybe. Adrenaline crash. "Where's the Coast Guard?" "Couldn't reach them. The radio's not working. I'm from the mainland. I have a boat. I can get you back." "Just you?" "Just me and my dog." Daniel kept his voice level, calm, the same tone he'd used with wounded soldiers who were scared and hurting. "What's your name?" The girl's jaw clenched. For a moment, Daniel thought she might run. Then her arms began to shake harder, and the branch dipped. "Emma," she whispered. "Emma, I'm Daniel. This is Ranger. We're going to get you home. But first I need to know, is anyone else here? Was anyone else on that boat?" Emma's face crumpled. The branch fell from her hands, and Daniel knew, even before she said the words, that this was worse than he'd thought. "My dad," Emma said, and her voice broke completely. "He fell in the water. I tried to grab him, but the boat flipped and he just..." She was shaking violently now, full body tremors. Daniel moved forward slowly, pulling the emergency blanket from his pack. "Emma, listen to me. How long ago?" "I don't know. Hours, this morning. I made it to shore and he didn't, and I built the fire but nobody came, and then I saw your boat and I thought maybe you were..." Her words tumbled over each other, sentence fragments held together by terror and exhaustion. Daniel wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. She was ice cold, too cold. Hypothermia was setting in fast. "Is your dad wearing a life jacket?" "Yes." "Orange, like mine." A life jacket meant he could still be afloat, could be. If he'd survived the initial wreck, if he'd avoided the rocks, if the current hadn't pulled him out to sea, if. Daniel's mind raced through possibilities. He had one boat, one teenager in shock, rough seas, a missing person who'd been in the water for hours in October temperatures. He made the calculation that every medic learns to make: triage, save who you can. But some part of him, the part that had joined the army to help people, the part that had carried wounded men through fire, the part that had spent 2 years hiding from the world because he couldn't save everyone, that part wasn't ready to make that call yet. "Emma, I need you to do exactly what I say. Can you do that?" She nodded, teeth chattering. "We're going back to the boat. You're going to stay with Ranger while I search the shoreline. If your dad's in the water with a life jacket, the current might have pushed him around the island. There's a chance." "He's alive?" Hope flared in her eyes, so bright and desperate it hurt to look at. Daniel couldn't lie. "I don't know, but I'm going to look, and then I'm getting you both home." Getting Emma back to the boat took longer than Daniel expected. Her legs kept giving out, shock and hypothermia stealing her strength. Twice she stumbled on the rocks, and both times Daniel caught her before she fell. Ranger stayed close, his solid presence seeming to steady her. When they reached the boat, Daniel wrapped her in his spare jacket and settled her in the stern. "Ranger, guard." The dog positioned himself beside Emma, his warmth and presence already helping. Service dogs knew their job. Emma's shaking hands found his fur, and she held on like he was the only solid thing in the world. "I'll be as quick as I can," Daniel said. "Stay in the boat, don't move, understand?" Emma nodded, but her eyes were distant, going into shock. He didn't have much time. Daniel took the boat's spotlight and began working his way around the island's perimeter, keeping close to shore. The swells were worse now, 4 feet easy, and the rain had started. Cold drops that stung his face and limited visibility to maybe 50 yards. He scanned every piece of water, every cluster of rocks, every break in the granite where a body might have washed up. His mind kept trying to do the math he didn't want to do. Water temperature in Penobscot Bay in October, 48 degrees. Survival time for an average adult, 1 to 3 hours. Time since the wreck. Emma said hours plural. 4, 5. The numbers didn't look good. But Daniel had seen men survive impossible situations. He'd seen a soldier with a severed femoral artery hold pressure on his own wound for 30 minutes. He'd seen a helicopter pilot walk away from a crash that should have killed everyone on board. He'd learned that impossible was just another word for hasn't happened yet. Halfway around the island, Ranger barked. Not his normal bark, his alert bark, the one that said he'd found something important. Daniel's head snapped toward the dog. Ranger was on his feet in the boat, staring at something in the water off the port side. There. 20 yards away, caught in a tangle of kelp and floating debris, an orange life jacket. And inside it, a man. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. He gunned the engine, fighting the swells, trying to get close without swamping the boat or hitting the person in the water. The man wasn't moving. 10 yards. 5. Daniel killed the engine and grabbed the boat hook, extending it toward the life jacket. "Ranger, balance!" The dog shifted his weight expertly as the boat rocked. Emma was leaning forward now, her eyes locked on the figure in the water. "Dad!" she screamed. "Dad!" No response, and Daniel hooked the life jacket and pulled. The weight was wrong, too heavy, too limp, but he pulled anyway, hand over hand, muscles straining. The man's face broke the surface, middle-aged, dark hair, eyes closed, lips blue. Not breathing. Daniel hauled him to the side of the boat. The man was dead weight, probably 200 pounds, soaked through. Daniel grabbed under the arms and heaved, using his legs, using every bit of strength he had. The boat tipped dangerously. Ranger moved to counterbalance. Emma grabbed the far gunwale. One massive pull, and the man's chest came over the side. Daniel got under him, lifted, and pulled him fully into the boat. He collapsed onto the deck, water streaming from his clothes. "Dad!" Emma was sobbing, trying to reach him. Daniel rolled the man onto his back. His skin was ice-cold, pale, waterlogged, no pulse at the carotid, no chest rise. But his jaw was slack, recently slack, not the rigid lock of hours dead. Daniel's training kicked in like muscle memory. Check airway, clear debris, head tilt, chin lift, 2 rescue breaths, watching for chest rise. Interlock hands, find hand placement, 30 compressions, 2 breaths, hard and fast, 100 compressions per minute. "Emma, I need you to stay calm. Can you count for me? Out loud, 1 to 30, then stop." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. 1, 2, 3. Daniel compressed. The man's chest gave under his hands, ribs flexing. Water bubbled from his mouth. Daniel turned his head, let it drain. Continued compressions. 28, 29, 30. 2 breaths. More water came up. Good. That was good. Meant there was still water in his lungs to expel. Meant he'd been breathing at some point recently. Compressions again. The boat rocked with the rhythm. Rain pounded the deck. Emma counted, her voice cracking but steady. 2 minutes. 3. Daniel's arms burned, his back screamed. He'd done CPR in training, on dummies, in controlled environments. This was different. This was a human being who'd been in 40-degree water, who'd been without oxygen for who knew how long, whose daughter was watching and counting and praying. 4 minutes, 5, nothing. But Daniel didn't stop. He'd learned in Afghanistan that you don't stop until someone tells you to stop. You don't give up because it's hard. You don't quit because the numbers say it's over. 6 minutes. The man's chest spasmed. Daniel froze, watched. Another spasm. And then a cough. Water exploded from the man's mouth, brackish and thick. His body convulsed, trying to clear his lungs. "Dad!" Emma lunged forward. "Don't touch him yet. Let him breathe." The man gasped, a horrible, rattling, wet sound, but a breath, and then another. His eyes flickered open, unfocused and glassy, but open. "You're okay," Daniel said, his voice rough. "You're in a boat. You're safe. Just breathe." The man tried to speak, but only coughed more water. Daniel rolled him on his side into a recovery position, let gravity help. The man's breathing was terrible, shallow, wheezing, wet. But he was breathing. Emma was crying so hard she couldn't speak, her hands hovering over her father like she was afraid to touch him, afraid he might disappear. Daniel sat back on his heels, his hands shaking with adrenaline. The man was alive. Against every rational odds, against the water temperature and the time and the circumstances, he was alive. Ranger pressed against Daniel's side, and Daniel realized his own breathing was ragged, his vision blurring at the edges. He'd done CPR dozens of times in the field. Half had worked, half hadn't. Those were good odds for combat medicine. But this one had worked. This man, this father, was breathing. "We need to get him warm," Daniel said, forcing himself back into action. "Emma, hold his hand. Talk to him. Keep him conscious." He grabbed every blanket, every piece of dry clothing he had, wrapped the man as best he could in the rocking boat. The man's eyes kept drifting closed. Hypothermia. Maybe drowning complications. Maybe worse. Daniel started the engine and pointed the bow toward the mainland. 3 miles, maybe 20 minutes in good conditions. In this weather, with this load, 30 minutes easy. 30 minutes where anything could go wrong, where the man could stop breathing again, where his core temperature could drop too far, where his heart could just give out. But they were moving. They were heading home. And the man was still breathing. Emma held her father's hand and whispered to him. Ranger stayed between them, his body heat adding to the warmth. Daniel pushed the throttle as hard as he dared, racing the weather, racing the cold, racing death itself. And somewhere in the wind and spray and desperate hope, Daniel realized something had shifted inside him. For 2 years he'd been hiding, avoiding, running from anything that reminded him of who he'd been as a medic. For 2 years he'd told himself that he was done saving people, that he'd lost too many, that he couldn't bear to face that responsibility again. But out here, in the middle of the Atlantic, with a dying man and a terrified girl and a service dog who believed in him, he'd become that person again without even realizing it. And it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like coming home. The mainland took forever to appear through the rain and spray. Daniel kept one hand on the throttle and one eye on Emma's father, who drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time his eyes closed, Emma would squeeze his hand tighter and call out, "Dad, stay with me, stay with me." And each time, miraculously, his eyes would open again. But Daniel knew they were running out of time. The man's breathing was deteriorating, more labored, more shallow. His lips had gone from blue to almost gray. Classic signs of severe hypothermia combined with near drowning. The longer they were exposed to wind and cold, the worse it would get. "How far?" Emma shouted over the engine noise. 10 minutes, maybe less." Maybe more, if the weather got worse. The swells were pushing 5 feet now, and the boat was taking water over the bow with every third wave. Not enough to sink them, but enough to make everything harder, colder, more desperate. Ranger was shivering. Even the dog, bred for endurance, was feeling the October cold. Daniel couldn't imagine what Emma's father was experiencing, if he could feel anything at all anymore. The dock finally materialized through the rain. Daniel had never been so grateful to see weathered wood in his life. He brought the boat in too fast, hit the pilings harder than he should have, but it held. He jumped out, secured the line, and turned back for the others. "Emma, can you walk?" She nodded, though her legs shook as she climbed onto the dock. "Then run to the cabin. First door on the right is the bathroom. Turn the shower on, hot as it gets. Fill the bathtub too. Go!" She ran. Daniel turned to Emma's father. The man's eyes were closed again. Daniel checked his pulse, weak, thready, but there. "Sir, I need you to help me. Can you hear me?" A slight nod. "I'm going to get you out of this boat. I need you to try to stand." Getting a near-unconscious, hypothermic man out of a rocking boat and up a steep dock was one of the hardest things Daniel had ever done. Harder than carrying wounded soldiers through desert heat. Harder than anything in his 2 years of hiding. But he did it. Ranger helped, positioning himself so the man could lean on him for balance. Together, they got him onto the dock, then up the path to the cabin. Emma had the shower running, steam already pouring into the bathroom. Daniel maneuvered the man into the tub, fully clothed. The warm water would help, but they had to be careful. Rewarm too fast and the shock could cause cardiac arrest. "Emma, stay with him. Keep him sitting up. Don't let him slip under the water. I'm calling for help." Daniel's landline, the one concession to safety he'd kept in his isolation, sat on the kitchen counter. He grabbed it, dialed 911, and gave the dispatcher the essential information. Near drowning, severe hypothermia, adult male, needs immediate transport. "Ambulance is 20 minutes out," the dispatcher said. "Stay on the line." 20 minutes. An eternity when someone's life hung in the balance. But Daniel had done his part. He'd found them. He'd brought them home. Now it was up to the man to keep fighting. He returned to the bathroom. Emma was crying again. But these were different tears. Relief tears. Her father's eyes were open, and he was looking at her with recognition. "Em," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You okay?" "I'm okay, Dad. You're okay. We're both okay." Daniel knelt beside the tub. The man's color was marginally better, still pale, but the gray was fading. His breathing was easier. The warm water was working. "What's your name?" Daniel asked. "Michael. Michael Reed." Each word seemed to cost him. "You saved us. You're not out of the woods yet. Ambulance is coming, but yeah, you're going to be okay." "The boat. I shouldn't have..." Michael's eyes filled with tears. Stupid. So stupid. Weather reports said it would hold, but the squall came out of nowhere and... "Don't," Daniel said firmly. "You made it. Your daughter made it. That's what matters." Michael's hand found Emma's. She built a fire. Smart girl. So smart. "Learn from the best," Emma said, managing a watery smile. Ranger pushed his way into the bathroom and sat beside Daniel, leaning against his leg. The dog was still shivering. Daniel wrapped a towel around him, held him close. They waited. 20 minutes turned into 25. The ambulance had to come from the nearest town, down winding coastal roads made treacherous by rain. But finally, blessedly, Daniel heard the siren. The EMTs were professional and efficient. They took over warming Michael, got him onto a stretcher, started an IV, checked his vitals. Emma rode in the ambulance with her father. Before they closed the doors, she looked back at Daniel. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know how to... just... thank you." Daniel nodded. Words felt inadequate anyway. And then they were gone, the ambulance disappearing down the driveway, leaving Daniel alone in his cabin with a soaking wet dog and an exhaustion that went bone deep. He collapsed into a chair. His hands were still shaking. Delayed reaction, he recognized. Adrenaline crash. The same thing he'd experienced dozens of times in Afghanistan, when the immediate danger passed and the body finally acknowledged what it had just been through. Ranger climbed into his lap, all 80 pounds of him, and Daniel didn't push him away. He wrapped his arms around the dog and let himself shake. He'd saved them. Both of them. Against odds that should have been impossible. And for the first time in 2 years, Daniel felt something besides numbness. He felt useful, needed. Like the skills he'd spent so long running from had actually mattered, like maybe he wasn't as broken as he'd thought. The phone call came 3 days later. Daniel almost didn't answer. He'd returned to his routine, coffee on the dock, maintenance around the property, long walks with Ranger, trying to pretend that nothing had changed, but everything had changed, and they both knew it. "Daniel Hayes? Speaking. This is Michael Reed. We wanted to thank you properly." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Much better. The doctor said another 10 minutes in the water and I wouldn't have made it." Michael's voice was stronger now, steady. "Emma told me what you did. The CPR. Getting us back. Everything." "I did what anyone would do." "No." Michael's tone was firm. "You did what a trained professional would do. The EMTs said your intervention made all the difference. I wanted you to know that." They talked for a few more minutes. Michael was being kept for observation, but the prognosis was good. No permanent damage, no complications. Just a very close call and a very lucky outcome. "We'd like to see you," Michael said before hanging up, "when I'm discharged, if you're willing." Daniel agreed, though he wasn't sure why. 4 days later, Michael and Emma appeared at his cabin. Michael looked thinner, older, but alive. Emma looked like a teenager again instead of a disaster survivor. Her hair clean, her clothes dry, the hollow terror gone from her eyes. They sat on the porch and drank coffee while Ranger sprawled at their feet, accepting Emma's attention like it was his due. "I've been thinking about that day," Michael said, "about what you risked to come after us. I saw the smoke. Anyone would have—" "No," Michael cut him off. "Most people would have called it in and waited for professionals. You took your boat out into rough seas. You performed CPR for 6 minutes. 6 minutes. The EMT said most people give up after 2. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. "Emma told me you were Army. A medic. Was 2 years ago. And now you live out here alone." It wasn't a question, so Daniel didn't answer. Michael was quiet for a moment. Then, "I run a nonprofit in Portland. We work with veterans transitioning back to civilian life, job placement, counseling, community building. It's not much, but we help where we can. That's good work. We could use someone like you." Daniel's head snapped up. "I'm not looking for—" "Not as an employee, as a volunteer. Maybe just come talk to some of the guys who are where you were, where I'm guessing you still are, at least partly." The words hit harder than they should have. Daniel looked away. "I'm not trying to push," Michael said gently. "I just know that what you did for us, that came from somewhere. From training, yes, but also from something deeper. And I think there are a lot of people who could benefit from that." Emma was watching him with those same desperate eyes from the island. Except now they weren't desperate for rescue. They were desperate for him to understand that he mattered. "I'll think about it," Daniel said, because it was the only thing he could say. Michael handed him a business card. "No pressure, but if you change your mind, call me." They left shortly after. Daniel stood on the porch, the business card in his hand, Ranger beside him. The dog looked up at him with what could only be described as expectation. "Don't start," Daniel muttered. Ranger's tail wagged. For a week, the business card sat on Daniel's kitchen counter. He walked past it every morning, every evening, tried to ignore it and failed. The problem was that Michael was right. The rescue had awakened something in Daniel that he'd been trying to suppress. Not just the skills. Anyone could learn CPR, learn search and rescue tactics. It was the feeling, the sense of purpose, the knowledge that he'd made a difference in a way that no amount of cabin maintenance or isolated living could match. Ranger sensed the shift. Dogs always knew. He stayed closer than usual, his eyes tracking Daniel's movements, his presence a constant reminder that healing wasn't about hiding. It was about finding new ways forward. On the 8th day, Daniel picked up the phone. "Michael Reed. It's Daniel Hayes. I'd like to take you up on that offer, if it's still open." "It is. When can you start?" That's how Daniel found himself driving into Portland 3 days a week, Ranger in the passenger seat, heading to a converted warehouse that housed Michael's nonprofit, Veterans Bridge. The first day was terrifying. Daniel walked into a room full of veterans, some his age, some younger, some older, and felt every instinct tell him to turn around and leave. These people didn't need his help. They didn't need to hear his story. They needed professionals, therapists, people who had their lives together. But then a kid, who couldn't have been more than 25, looked at him and said, "You're the guy who saved Michael Reed, the island rescue." Word had spread. Apparently the local news had picked up the story. Coast Guard veteran saves father and daughter from shipwreck. They'd gotten some of the details wrong. Daniel wasn't Coast Guard, just Army, but the core was accurate. "Yeah," Daniel said. "That was me." "That's badass, man. How'd you know what to do?" And just like that, Daniel was talking about his training, about the rescue, about the CPR, the hypothermia protocol, the emergency response. He kept it technical, clinical, focused on the procedures. But then someone asked, "What made you go out there when you saw the smoke?" Daniel paused, looked at Ranger who sat calmly beside him, looked at the faces around the room, all of them carrying their own wounds, their own stories, their own battles with coming home. I didn't think, he admitted. I just knew someone needed help. And I guess I needed to help them. The room was quiet, understanding quiet. That's the hard part, isn't it? Said an older veteran, probably Vietnam era. Knowing you can still do something useful, knowing your training still matters, but not knowing where to put it. Yeah, Daniel said, that's exactly it. The conversation opened up after that. People shared their stories, about coming home, about struggling to find purpose, about feeling like they'd left the most meaningful part of themselves overseas. Daniel listened more than he talked, but when he did speak, people listened. After the session, Michael pulled him aside. You're good at this. I didn't do anything. You showed up. You were honest. That's more than most people manage. Michael paused. I want to start a new program, wilderness safety and emergency response training for veterans. Teach them skills they can use to help their communities, give them purpose. I'd need someone to run it. Daniel's first instinct was to say no. But he thought about the rescue, about Emma building that fire, about pulling Michael from the water, about the moment when everything had clicked into place and he'd remembered who he used to be. Let me think about it, he said. Take your time. But Daniel, I wouldn't ask if I didn't think you could do it. That night, Daniel sat on his porch with Ranger and watched the sun set over the Atlantic, the same view he'd had for 2 years. But it looked different now. Seal Island was visible in the distance, a dark smudge against the orange sky. 3 weeks ago, it had been just another piece of geography. Now, it was the place where everything changed. What do you think, boy? Daniel asked. Ranger's tail thumped against the deck. Yeah, I think so too. Part 7. The program. 6 months later, Daniel stood in front of a group of 15 veterans in the Maine woods, teaching them wilderness survival and emergency response. They'd spent the morning on fire-building techniques, the same skills Emma had used to signal for help. Now they were moving on to water rescue scenarios. Daniel had brought in actual Coast Guard instructors to help, wanting to ensure everything was done properly and safely. But he was the one leading it. He was the one who'd designed the curriculum, who'd identified the skills that mattered, who understood that this wasn't just about teaching people how to save others. It was about teaching them how to save themselves. The key to any rescue, Daniel explained, is assessment before action. You have to know what you're walking into before you commit. Otherwise, you're just creating more victims. A young woman in the group raised her hand. What if there's no time for assessment? What if someone's drowning right now? Then you make the fastest assessment you can. Look at the water conditions. Look at your own abilities. Look at what resources you have. He paused. But you never, ever go in unless you're confident you can get back out. A dead rescuer helps no one. The training was intense. Daniel pushed them hard, but not harder than he pushed himself. They learned CPR, wilderness first aid, water rescue, cold weather survival. They practiced until the skills became automatic, until they could respond without thinking. But more than that, they built something together. A community. A purpose. The same kind of unit cohesion Daniel had experienced in the military, but translated into civilian life. Michael Reed came to visit during the 3rd week of the program. His recovery had been complete. He'd even taken up swimming, determined not to let fear rule his life. Emma was with him, and she'd brought something. I wanted you to have this, she said, handing Daniel a framed photograph. And it showed the two of them on the boat, both soaked and exhausted, with Ranger between them. Daniel didn't remember anyone taking it. Later he learned it was from the EMT's body camera. But there it was. Proof that the rescue had happened. Proof that he'd done something that mattered. Thank you, Emma said again. Not just for saving us, but for showing me what real courage looks like. Daniel's throat tightened. You had your own courage, building that fire, staying calm, taking care of yourself until help arrived. I learned from Dad, and that day, I learned from you. After they left, Daniel hung the photograph in the Veterans Bridge office. It became a symbol of what the program was about, using skills to help others, finding purpose in service, saving yourself by saving someone else. The program grew. Word spread. Veterans from across Maine started attending. Some came for the skills, some came for the community, some came because they recognized in Daniel's story something of their own struggle to find meaning after service. Daniel had never intended to become a public face for veteran transition programs, but life had other plans. Local news did a feature on the wilderness program. Then regional media picked it up. Then someone from a national veterans organization called, interested in replicating the model in other states. Through it all, Ranger was there. The dog attended every training session, his calm presence helping veterans who struggled with anxiety or PTSD. He'd become as much a part of the program as Daniel himself. One evening, after a particularly long training day, Michael found Daniel sitting alone in the office, looking at a map of the Maine coast. "Planning something?" Michael asked. "Just thinking about how different things look now. 6 months ago, I was hiding in a cabin, trying to forget I'd ever been a medic. Now I'm teaching emergency response to other veterans." "Regret it?" "No, just surprised. I didn't think I'd ever feel useful again." Michael sat down. "You know what Emma told me the other day? She said she wants to become an EMT. Because of you. Because you showed her that helping people in their worst moments is the most important thing anyone can do." Daniel didn't trust himself to respond. "You changed more than you know that day," Michael continued. "Not just Emma and me. You changed yourself. You remembered who you were, who you still are." "I'm still figuring that out." "Aren't we all?" Michael stood. "But at least now you're figuring it out by helping others do the same. That counts for something." After Michael left, Daniel looked again at the photograph on the wall. The exhausted faces, the soaking clothes, the faithful dog, the moment when everything changed. He'd gone to that island thinking he was just responding to a distress signal, but he'd come back with something more valuable than he'd ever expected. A reminder that the skills he'd thought were useless still had purpose, that the training he'd tried to forget was exactly what the world needed, that healing wasn't about running away from who you'd been, but finding new ways to use those hard-won lessons. That sometimes the person you save when you answer a call for help is yourself. 2 years after the rescue, Daniel stood at the edge of Penobscot Bay and watched 20 veterans board boats for a training exercise. This had become an annual event, the Seal Island Challenge. Teams would navigate to the island, demonstrate search and rescue skills, and return safely. It was part training, part team building, part memorial for all the close calls that could have gone differently. Emma was there, now in EMT training at the local community college. She volunteered as a safety observer, her experience on the island giving her a perspective that no classroom could teach. Michael was there too, having joined the Veterans Bridge Board of Directors. His near-death experience had transformed from trauma into purpose. But the biggest change was in the program itself. What had started as Daniel's small wilderness training course had grown into a comprehensive emergency response program for veterans across 3 states. They'd trained over 200 veterans in life-saving skills. 12 of them had gone on to become professional EMTs or firefighters. 7 had used their training to save actual lives in their communities. One of those rescues had made national news. A veteran from Daniel's second cohort had pulled 3 children from a burning house in Portland. When reporters asked where he'd learned his skills, he'd credited the Veterans Bridge program. More specifically, he'd credited Daniel's story about the island rescue, about responding when others might have waited for professionals, about trusting your training even when you're scared. The program had saved lives. But more than that, it had saved people from the quiet desperation Daniel had known so well. The feeling that your best days were behind you, that your skills were obsolete, that the world had moved on without you. "Ready to address the group?" Michael asked, walking up beside him. Daniel nodded. He still didn't love public speaking, but he'd gotten better at it. Practice, like everything else. The veterans gathered around, their faces showing the same mix of determination and uncertainty Daniel remembered from his early days in the program. 2 years ago, Daniel began, I was living alone in a cabin, convinced that the most useful part of my life was over. I'd served as a combat medic. I'd saved lives. But I'd also lost people I couldn't save. And I didn't know how to live with that. The crowd was silent. They understood. They'd all been there in one way or another. Then, one morning, I saw smoke rising from an island. I could have ignored it, could have driven to town and reported it, could have left it for someone else. Instead, I took a boat and my dog and went to help. Daniel gestured toward the island, visible in the distance. What I found there was a teenager who'd survived a shipwreck, and her father who'd been in the water too long. The rational odds said he was dead. The water temperature said it was impossible. Everything in the textbook said I was too late. Emma was watching him, tears already forming in her eyes. But I'd learned in the military that you don't stop until someone tells you to stop. So I didn't stop. And against every rational expectation, he survived. Daniel paused. That rescue taught me something important. It taught me that the skills we learned in service, the training, the discipline, the refusal to give up, those things don't expire when we come home. They're still valuable. We're still valuable. We just need to find new ways to use what we know. He looked at the veterans around him. That's what this program is about, teaching you the skills, yes, but more importantly, reminding you that you still have something to offer, that your experience matters, that someone, somewhere, someday is going to need exactly what you can give them, and when that moment comes, you'll be ready. The boats launched shortly after. Daniel watched them navigate toward the island, each team working together, using the skills they'd learned. Ranger sat beside him, older now, his muzzle showing gray, but still alert and present. "Good dog," Daniel murmured, scratching behind the shepherd's ears. Later that evening, after the exercises concluded and everyone had returned safely, Daniel found himself alone on his dock, the same dock where this had all started, the same view. But he was different now. The cabin was no longer a hiding place. It was a home base, a place to recharge before heading back out into the world. His phone buzzed. A text from Emma. Got accepted into the paramedic program starting in fall. Daniel smiled. The ripples kept spreading. Over the past 2 years, he'd learned something essential. Healing wasn't linear. There were still days when the memories were too much, when the ghosts of people he couldn't save felt more real than the living people around him. There were still nights when Ranger had to wake him from nightmares, but those days were getting fewer. The good days, the days when he felt useful, needed, alive, were getting more frequent. The balance was shifting. He thought about the chain of events that had brought him here, one column of smoke, one decision to help, one successful rescue that had reminded him who he was. And from that single moment, hundreds of lives touched, veterans finding purpose, communities gaining trained responders, a teenage girl becoming an EMT, a father learning that near death could become a catalyst for life, all because Daniel had seen smoke and decided it meant something. The sun set over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Seal Island was a dark silhouette against the colors. Daniel raised his coffee mug toward it, a silent acknowledgement of the place that had changed everything. "Thank you," he said to the island, to the sky, to whatever force had put that smoke signal in his line of sight on a gray October morning. Ranger leaned against his leg, solid and warm and present. Tomorrow, Daniel would head back to Portland for another training session. Next week, he'd start working with a new cohort of veterans. Next month, he'd travel to Boston to consult on setting up a similar program there. But tonight, he sat on his dock with his dog and watched the sunset, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the peace of hiding, not the peace of avoidance, but the peace of knowing that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The peace of a mission accomplished, and another one just beginning.